Hello and welcome. This is your instructor going over the final review questions 5 and 6, A, B, and C. And slide 1 will be for 5A and 6A. Slide 2 will be for 5B and 6B. And slide 3 will be for 5C and 6C. We are dealing with the neoclassical model, the new classical model. Those who believe in Adam Smith's beginning assumptions about the private economy and how it self-adjusts and works near perfection on its own without government interference. And always in this model we're going to start where AS and AD intersect on long-run aggregate supply. Note here in this graphic they note LRAS as ASLR, same thing. And down below, rather than using capital Y, they're using capital Q. Now, always in the long run, they're intersecting all three lines together, so we can see we're starting at point A. Now, if we're starting at point A, we're in the long run. Anytime we're off of the long run aggregate supply curve, we're in the short run, so point B represents the short run there as well. Also remember, the short run is characterized by people being ignorant of inflation or unaware of inflation. And the long run, they become aware of inflation. So here we see an example of cost push inflation, higher oil prices, higher input costs, higher wages, lower productivity, higher business regulations, lower business taxes. Any of those determinants would shift in the AS curve and we move from point A to point B. Note that at point B we have a recessionary gap, we also have an increase in prices, and we are in the short run. This model, the neoclassical model that believes that government should not do anything to help the economy, shows us that if we shift back to point B because of increased input costs and experience stagflation, that is lower growth or slower growth with higher prices, that the economy will self-adjust. If companies are experiencing the recession like most companies do, and that means earning less profit, they're going to themselves look at ways to restructure their business, lay people off, become more efficient in order to regain their own profits. So the shift back from AS1 to AS2, from point A to point B, can actually be fixed all by itself by businesses following their own incentives, trying to make the most profit. And so they claim that you would move back, but then businesses would shift it back over time by lowering their costs. Therefore, the best option would be to do nothing. On the other hand, let's say rather than classical economists who tend to be conservative in their use of government, we have more liberal, Democrat type politicians who see the stagflation caused moving from point A to point B with a shift back in the AS curve, and they decide to do something such as increase government spending that would shift out the AD curve. Now notice that shifting 81 to 82 from point B to point C, we have eliminated the recession, but we have a bad result for everybody, and that is that prices have gone from P1 to P3. Whereas with the first option of doing nothing, AS shifted back for a time, but then through layoffs of some people shifted it back to point A so that everyone else could enjoy the lower prices. So the difference here is that with the conservative classical model, you let some feel the pain, the layoffs, the restructuring, so the entire economy can get back to point A, whereas their prediction of liberal policies of doing something would lead us to a point where everyone suffers, where you move from point A to point B, but then the government gets involved, increases spending, that shifts out the AD curve, and we end up with everyone paying a higher level of prices. Now on to B. So this would be 5B and 6B. And it has to do with anything that's going to shift out the AD curve. So let's say there's increased consumption, and we have a shift out from A to B, or say an increase in government spending. We want to lower unemployment, even lower than full employment level of unemployment. So AD shifts from A to B, AD1 to AD2. And we see a growth in GDP, we see a growth in prices. Remember, we're in the short run if we're not on the long run aggregate supply curve. So in the short run we're ignorant of inflation, but when we reach the long run, people become aware that prices have increased from P1 to P2. And what are people going to do? They're going to demand higher wages to make up for those price increases. And those higher wages lead to higher input costs that then shift back the AS curve. So here again we see where government gets involved, let's say through higher government spending, it might create a short burst in economic activity out to point B with higher prices, but in the long run people are going to demand higher wages and thus just shift the entire curve back so that there's no growth. Now remember the criticism here. If the government spending was something that created productivity, it could be that AS shifts back all on its own, even with the higher wages, because the country's become more productive and LRAS has moved out, let's say to point B. Then we would have AD2, AS would move back to AS1, and LRAS would move, so it's intersecting all of those there at point B, and we could enjoy some economic growth, though with price increases. Lastly, C on 5 and 6. Here we see the effects of a recession. So let's consider our current recession that was led by drops in consumption and investment spending that shifted back the AD curve, shifting us from point A to point B, where we have lower prices but now a recessionary gap. Here, what would be assumed to take place if we didn't have generous unemployment benefits and other government subsidy programs, people would be willing to take lower wages and work, shifting the AS curve out and moving us naturally out to point C. This is a really interesting proposition, that in these tough economic times, if we are providing our unemployed and our poor too much, then they won't settle for lower wages. They won't go out and work in the fields, and thus AS won't shift out. Because if indeed people were willing to take lower wages in tough economic times, and with the understanding that prices have decreased when we went from point A to point B, that we could all be better off, because AS would shift out, prices would drop for everybody, so even if you took a lower wage, your real income would likely be not going down as much as it could have otherwise. So here's a story of how a recession can actually be a good thing, that is if and only if people are willing to take pay cuts.